I used to eat over a kilogram of vegetables per day, thinking that they were the healthiest food on the planet. But one day I discovered the unbelievable truth about them. In this video, I'll discuss how vegetables are poisonous to us and why, despite popular belief, you should never consume them. And at the end of the video, I'll give you the solution as to what you should eat instead. As the great philosopher Nietzsche once said, convictions are greater enemies of the truth than lies. Whenever I tell people what I'm about to tell you, they simply cannot believe it. They have been conditioned their entire life that of course vegetables are good for you, and their minds just simply cannot comprehend the fact that they could possibly be wrong. Every single plant that humans consume is toxic in some way. Now, this isn't my opinion. This is a pure objective fact. To really drill this in, let me give you a thought experiment. If you got lost in a forest, would you go and eat some random plant? No, of course you would not, because intuitively you know that that plant could be poisonous and it could harm you. Even intuitively, we humans know that plants can harm us. However, as soon as a person in a position of authority describes a plant as a vegetable, all of a sudden it's immune from these toxins and it becomes healthy? It makes no fundamental sense. These health foods like mushrooms, garlic, avocados, and onions, they all kill cats and dogs if they consume them. Why is that? Because they contain toxins. Now, just because they don't kill us immediately like they do with these cats and dogs, it does not mean that they are not harming us. Let's have a look at this. Think of it like this. Plants are trying to kill you. Now, where most people make the mistake is that they think of this as a literal thing. They go, well, obviously that's not true. Plants don't have a brain. They don't care if we live or die. But how this expression should actually be taken is in the metaphorical sense. Plants are trying to kill you because they want to survive themselves. They don't have little meetups on the brink of dawn when night is the darkest and discuss how they're going to try and kill as many humans as possible, but because they want to survive, they have developed toxins that do harm us. Plants obviously are a living organism, and every single living organism has two main goals: to survive and to reproduce. Now, in order to survive, it must defend itself in some way from potential attackers. Animals, they can run, they can bite, they can kick. The case of kangaroos, they can even punch. But plants, obviously, they are stationary, so they are not able to defend themselves through these physical methods. Instead, they have what is known as defense compounds. These defense compounds are in every single plant, including all of the fruits and vegetables that we consume. As a result of these compounds, vegetables are highly inflammatory to us. They cause cellular damage. They mess with our hormones. I'll get into exactly how this works shortly, but think about this. When you eat a vegetable, why does it taste bitter? This bitter taste is our taste buds identifying these defense compounds and trying to deter us from eating it. It's no different to how we can sense that a food is expired, that it's gone off, simply because we get an unpleasant smell from it. Now, when I say this, a lot of people say, well, Max, I actually like vegetables. Maybe you do when it's cooked in lots of butter, when it's seasoned nicely. But most people don't like eating vegetables raw. And even if you do, go 1 month without eating it and you won't like it. The only reason that vegetables start to taste alright after a while is because it is a survival adaptation. Because you're consuming it frequently, our bodies think, wow, there must be a food scarcity. If we don't start to like this and it is our only energy source, we'll stop consuming it and therefore die of starvation. An acquired taste of something is a survival adaptation. Give any baby bacon and they'll love it, but give any baby a vegetable and they'll hate it. Over time, we become accustomed to these things and they start to taste good. But trust me, go 1 month without your favorite vegetable and you'll see how bitter it tastes. So how did plants get these defense compounds? Well, there's two views. If you believe in God, the creationist view is that God gave these plants defense compounds. Plants are essential for all life. If plants were completely undefended and everyone just went around eating all of them, it would cause serious ecosystem issues. And if you don't believe in God, then there's the evolutionary view, which is that these defense compounds were developed over time. It's actually incredibly fascinating, and we'll get into that shortly, but let's first look at some examples of these defense compounds. The first one I'm going to look at is tannins. Now, tannins are a compound that binds to proteins. They're present in spinach, tea, berries, many spices. Now, tannins present two major problems. The first being is that, wow, they bind to proteins, and our gut lining actually has protein molecules on the outside of it. So these tannins, we consume them and then they end up binding to our guts, which causes inflammation. Now, inflammation is the root cause of every issue, so obviously it goes without saying that that is not ideal. Now, the second problem with tannins is that they bind to many nutrients. So when we consume all these nutrient-dense foods, we can't absorb any of it. It just ends up going straight through us. I'll get into this in more detail later in the video, but there are many studies that show all these nutrients in plants We actually have a very hard time at absorbing any of them due to the different defense compounds such as tannins. What I find very fascinating about tannins and many of these other defense compounds is that when we extract them from the plant and isolate them into a tannin extract, that extract is very bitter, which further supports the hypothesis that the reason vegetables taste bitter is due to these defense compounds. Another defense compound which is present in so many foods that most people consume on a day-to-day basis is lectins. Now, lectins differ from tannins as lectins are a protein themselves. However, they bind to carbohydrates, which again, our gut lining has carbohydrate molecules, so they're going to bind to our guts and also cause inflammation. Now, lectins are found in wheat, rice, potatoes, tomatoes, and they're actually a poison themselves. They're very high in kidney beans, which is why we have to soak and ferment them before we can consume them. A lot of people don't know this about kidney beans, but if we eat them raw, they are poisonous. You can die from consuming them. Now, this is just two of a very long list of different defense compounds. There's some very fascinating ones like cyanide, which is in almonds, which has quite literally been used by assassins throughout history to assassinate people. But I won't bore you by going on all day about my favorite defense compounds. Instead, I'll answer a question that I know you have. If these defense compounds are so toxic, why is it that other animals can consume them? I mean, gorillas, they have no disease, but all they do is eat bamboo all day. Wouldn't bamboo have these toxins? The answer is yes, every plant has toxins. However, these animals are very different to us. They have a number of adaptations or traits that allow them to break down these plants. Gorillas are what is known as hindgut digesters. So they have a massive cecum and intestines that are able to ferment these plants, which quite literally changes the structure of these plants. When humans consume fiber, it counts as 0 calories because we just cannot absorb it. It goes straight through us. However, gorillas, for every gram of fiber they consume, it counts as 2 calories because they ferment the fiber and turn it into short-chain fatty acids. Now, during this fermentation process, they are able to break down these defense compounds. The same goes with every species that consume plants. Cows are what is known as ruminant animals, which means they have these large multi-chambered stomachs which do the same. They're also able to ferment plants. Now, if you are a creationist, the view is that God gave these animals these traits in order to break them down. However, if you believe in evolution, then there is a theory called the evolutionary arms race, which essentially suggests that if a species eats a plant for an extended period of time, it begins to develop adaptations to break down the defense compounds that are in that plant. It's no different to how Russia and America are always racing to see who can develop the best weaponry. An example of this that I find very interesting is with goats. With goats, in their saliva, there's an enzyme called tannins, which its specific function is to break down tannins. Remember the defense compound that we talked about earlier? It's essentially a battle of survival. It's pretty fascinating stuff, I gotta say. But here's the issue for us. We haven't consumed plants for very long at all. In fact, only 12,000 years ago, humans started agriculture. This is when we went through the agricultural revolution. 12,000 years ago and prior, humans were a carnivorous species. We know this because when we look at our fossils, they're very high in something known as nitrogen-15. Essentially, how it works is the more carnivorous a species is, the higher it is in nitrogen-15. And humans were the most carnivorous species on the planet. More carnivorous than lions, more carnivorous than wolves, more carnivorous than every other species. In order to develop the necessary adaptations or traits to be able to fully break down the defense compounds in a plant, it takes millions of years, or it's completely impossible if you're a creationist. Let's look at some of the man-made issues with vegetables. Unfortunately, humans have created something known as pesticides, which are essentially a bunch of lab-made chemicals doused on our plants so insects, bugs, and other predators don't get to them. The harsh truth is that vegetables cannot grow without these things. Vegetables are some of the least toxic plants, which is why we can eat them without dying instantly. Now, as I've talked about, they do cause a number of problems, but we just don't die instantly from them. And as a result of them having less of this defense, they just get eaten by insects. Anyone who's ever tried to grow some vegetables in their garden knows exactly what I'm talking about. The main pesticide glyphosate is literally banned in some countries. Now, the mistake a lot of people make is they think, well, I wash my vegetables, so therefore I'm not consuming any of these pesticides. But what they fail to consider is that these pesticides are designed to withstand torrential rain. I'm talking hail, storm. They cannot have these things coming off, otherwise the bugs get to them. So unfortunately, no matter how incredible your tap system is, it is not getting these things off. Now on screen right now, you can see the ingredients of these pesticides. I won't bore you by going into each detail with exactly what each ingredient does to you. However, I'm sure just by looking at that list alone, you can come to a pretty concrete conclusion that these things are not good for you. But what about organic vegetables? Here's the thing about organic. It is a pure marketing term. Organic is not a real thing. What does organic mean? From a natural source. Now, technically speaking, everything comes from a natural source at one point or another. The only difference between natural and unnatural is that natural hasn't had its chemical composition altered in some lab. So instead, what they do with organic pesticides is that they just get the most poisonous plants and pour it on the less poisonous plants. Unfortunately, by eating organic, it is, I don't even know if it's any better, but maybe just a slight bit better. Again, on screen are the ingredients for an organic pesticide. By the way, neem oil is a seed oil. So all these health conscious, organic, live off the land people who think they're healthy by eating lots of vegetables, in reality, you're consuming lots of seed oils. And perhaps the worst thing about vegetables is that they're getting worse by the day. Regardless as to your worldview, these vegetables are becoming more and more defended by the day due to a process known as natural selection. Natural selection, put very simply, is that if an organism has traits that are advantageous for its survival, it is more likely to survive and therefore it is more likely to reproduce. Now we see this with animals. The bigger, the faster the animal is, the more chance it has at surviving. And so what happens is all the slow and small animals, they die out. They never reproduce, but the big fast ones do. So over time, this certain type of animal, on average, they just get bigger and faster. Now the same happens with plants. The ones that grow bigger, they're exposed to more sun. The ones that go slow, they get no sun and then end up dying. But where this applies to us as well, the more defended a plant is, the more chance of survival that it has. So even if there was some non-toxic plant that existed at some point in history, that thing is now long gone. The predators have got to it because it did not have traits that are advantageous for its survival. Now, this isn't the only thing. We also have issues with the toxicity of these plants getting worse due to human intervention. Like I talked about earlier, 12,000 years ago, we started agriculture. Now, because humans are so intelligent, we discovered something called selective breeding. Essentially, how this works is if you grow two plants close to each other, they cross-pollinate one another, and you get this third hybrid style of plant, which is a combination of characteristics of the two other plants. So what happens is we started creating our own variations of plants. Now again, with the process of natural selection, only the plants that are more defended would survive. The craziest part about all of this is that humans got so good at selective breeding, we quite literally started creating our own plants. Broccoli is not real. It is a strain of wild cabbage. In fact, if you saw what corn actually looked like before we started the selective breeding, you would not believe your eyes. A completely unrecognizable plant. It is actually incredible stuff. Now, to make matters worse, we've started doing this in a lab. There's this process called GMO, which essentially we get a gene from one plant, copy it, and paste it into another plant. Now, some people argue that this is a good thing. As we've seen many times throughout history, you can't out nature nature. Nature, God, the universe, whatever you want to call it, they always have the last laugh. It seems to be that as soon as we mess with something, it ends incredibly unfavorably towards us, and I believe this is going to be the exact same thing. But what about the good of vegetables? There's all these magical nutrients that we need that make us feel good, they make us healthy. Well, here's the thing. We cannot absorb the majority of these. Like I talked about earlier with the different defense compounds, these nutrients, they bind to them, which seriously inhibits their absorption. Even fiber. People love to talk about the importance of fiber, but we literally cannot break it down. These nutrients bind to fiber and they pass straight through us. Whenever we examine the nutrient absorption rate, which is known as bioavailability of vegetables, we can only absorb a very small amount of the nutrients that are in them. There is a solution to this, which I'll get into shortly, but first I want to break down an argument. A lot of people talk about these mythical blue zone areas, these certain areas in the world where people are super healthy and live a long time. The claim is that in these areas, they eat a plant-based diet. For starters, this just isn't true. Whenever people go visit these blue zone areas, they're actually eating a lot more meat than the studies claim, which is a weird coincidence because these studies are often funded by plant-based companies. I don't know how that ended up happening. Maybe some of you guys know. So yeah, essentially, not a true claim. But even if it was, in these blue zones, people are only living to 80 years old. Human potential is 120 years. Every single organ in our body is able to live to 120. So if we just get out of the way of things and don't cause any inflammation, that's how long we'll live to. But like I said, in these blue zones, they're only averaging around 80 years. So are the people in these countries actually healthy? Or are we just comparing them to countries, say, like USA, UK, Australia, or even New Zealand, where I'm from, where most people are eating highly processed diets. So, what is the solution to all this? Now, people usually have a lot to say about this, but the solution is to eat the proper human diet, which is a carnivore diet. In meat, we can get every single nutrient we need in the perfect quantities, but there are none of these toxins. There has not been a single study that has ever shown that red meat is bad for us. A lot of people like to say, well, our ancestors were carnivores and they only lived to 40. This just fundamentally is not true. Like I talked about, for the last 12,000 years, we've eaten plants. We haven't been a carnivorous species. And what's super fascinating is when we find fossils that are 12,000 years ago and older, they're in great condition. Remember, this is when we only ate meat. When we look at these old fossils, they have very few lesions and markings on them, which indicates that they had very little disease and illness. However, all of our fossils in the last 12,000 years, they do have lots of these lesions and markings, as well as the fact that we've actually gotten smaller. Our brain size has shrunk 11% in the last 12,000 years. The truth is, we don't know how long our carnivorous ancestors lived for. There are myths of us living to 120, like we're supposed to, but based on the fact that our fossils were incredibly healthy, we likely lived very long and healthy lives despite what most people believe. Now, if you're still skeptical about the carnivore diet, I debated ChatGPT on this very topic the other day. Remember, AI has access to all the information on the internet, every study on the internet, and I managed to convince it that the carnivore diet is the proper human diet and that we should all be eating it. So click this video if you want to find out more. Subscribe for more videos like this, send this to a friend who still thinks that vegetables are good for them, and I'll see you guys next time.